This is a systemic problem. This is not onesie, twosie cases. This is not just the histrionic spouse that comes out and says that her house isn't good enough. This is a systemic issue from the top of these corporations that are running military housing.
This is Military Matters. I'm Rod Rodriguez. This episode is brought to you by Tekto Gear, TEKTOGEAR.com, a Portland, Maine-based tactical knife company. The knives are created by the CNC process to provide the best precision, functionality, and beauty. The Tekto Gear knives won't cost a half month's rent either. Today, Tekto Gear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Go to TEKTOGEAR.com. Use the discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase. Last week, we replayed our Tenant Bill of Rights episode from Season 3. In preparation for this episode, an update from Stars and Stripes reporter Rose Thayer. So if you haven't already, go check out last week's episode and then come back for the update. But let's be real. It's pretty doubtful that you're expecting good news, right? It's unlikely but possible that we were going to report, hey, that Tenant Bill of Rights thing worked out, so here's the update. Your intuition on this one is probably right. It's not working out the way that many military housing tenants would want it to. So to help better explain the situation, Stars and Stripes reporter Rose Thayer.
My name is Rose Thayer, and I'm a regional reporter for Stars and Stripes. I write about all issues affecting service members and veterans in the western part of the U.S.
What was the intent of Tenant Bill of Rights?
So the intent of the Tenant Bill of Rights was to provide tenants a clear understanding of what they are afforded when they rent from privatized military housing. So it's some of it is really basic. It's like a habitable home, appliances that work. It's also this dispute resolution process, because before, if you disagreed with what the housing company told you, you didn't really have a path to say, hey, I disagree. I don't think they're treating me correctly. Whereas, in the civilian world, you could move with a different company. You could go to the Better Business Bureau. There's a lot of consumer protections between renters and landlords that just don't exist in this sphere. It also has things like if there are repairs on your home, you should have a right to be relocated. But there's also a lot of terms in there that are vague that advocates are sort of pushing to get fixed, such as, the housing should meet industry standards, or the repairs should be industry standards. Well, what are industry standards, and because this is the US and every state has different laws, is it the state you're residing in's industry standards? Is it a different state's? Is it the federal? Is it HUD? Where are those lines drawn? And so there's a lot of ambiguity that the housing companies and the military are sort of waiting around trying to understand, and then residents are understanding it in a different way, and it's still just causing everyone to sort of butt heads. It took probably 2 years to get all the 18 rights out to military families. And that was in part because the military had to get none of this is in the pre-existing contracts that have 50-year limits on them. So the military had to get these businesses to willingly agree to these changes.
So Rose, you wrote a story about, we actually talked before in a previous podcast. Since that episode, you have reapproached this story. Tell me why.
Well, I decided to reapproach the story because I spoke to some families that actually participated in some of the rights that are available in the Tenant Bill of Rights. And they just, they were left feeling a little disappointed by their experiences. I think an example is Alexis Jennings went through the dispute resolution process at Camp Pendleton. And during the process, she told the commander of Camp Pendleton, who was going through the process as the deciding authority, you're supposed to hire an independent investigator to look at my case and make a recommendation to you. And he basically told her, no, I don't have to do that. And it is part of the Defense Department policy that should be done. So at the end of the process, she felt like it had been sort of tainted because she didn't have this outside set of eyes looking at the situation.
To help us understand how the Tenant Bill of Rights has fallen short of its intent, Rose spoke with Navy spouse Alexis Jennings, whose recent issues with her own dispute resolution illustrate many of the issues other service members' families are also grappling with.
Alexis Jennings is a Navy spouse who lives at Camp Pendleton, California. She's in a really sort of difficult situation in that her husband recently, I say recently, it's probably been a couple years now, had a heart transplant. He had, an emergency situation while he's on active duty, and he's now in a warrior transition unit working to medically retire from the Navy. And they're in this housing in California while he's trying to recover, and they've just really sort of struggled with that.
My husband, James Jennings, he's been active duty Navy for about 12 years. Previously, we had lived on Marine Corps Base Kaneohe Bay on Oahu in Hawaii, and lived on base in Ohana Communities, which is a property division of Hunt. Experience overall was generally good. We had your normal expected maintenance issues, and we felt that Hunt was reasonably responsive to those. We've also lived in San Diego, in Lincoln Military Housing, which is now Liberty, in off-base housing. And again, it seemed to go pretty well for us. We didn't have any significant issues there. However, when we did move to Camp Pendleton, it's been nothing short of a nightmare, unfortunately. We've had various incidents with water intrusion, mold, mice, lack of communication, lack of honest answers from Liberty Military Housing, failure, what we feel is failure to resolve the issue, and lack of involvement from the DoD, or I should say lack of effective involvement from the DoD. So it's definitely been a different experience on Camp Pendleton, one that is not good.
And so can you tell me what it was that initially triggered you to go ahead and try to access this dispute resolution process, which is new, and you're one of the first dozen or so families to go through it in the military? Alexis, can you tell me what it was? I know you had a number of issues going on in your home that you felt were unresolved. So what was it that finally led you to reach out to this new process and request dispute resolution?
Yeah, so we had a water intrusion incident in June of last year, June of 2021, that became a huge source of contention between my family and Liberty. We had disputes regarding how to properly remediate it, what that meant as far as maintenance work and scope, mold remediation and things of that sort. And essentially, it boiled down to an issue of displacement for our family and what that means. Where do we go? What, as a family of 6, where would we fit into? Should we be forced into a smaller home? And for how long? Those were the types of questions we had that we never really received a clear or concise answer on. I was told by an unrelated third-party advocate, actually outside of Camp Pendleton, about the dispute resolution process, which was newly implemented. I had heard by Congress after doing some research. I felt that, I was hopeful that process would formalize the dispute we were having with Liberty and bring it to resolution for our family.
Mm-hmm. And that process is pretty detailed as far as what's required of commanders to do for the families, and what sort of, I guess, rights you're afforded through that process. One of them being an independent investigator who's not affiliated with, anyone in the dispute to look at the situation and give a recommendation to the commander. Was that the first, when that independent investigator wasn't appointed in your case, was that the first time that you sort of saw red flags that the process wasn't going well?
Actually, no. The first time that we noticed that procedurally this wasn't being followed was the timelines. So, we were aware, based on reading the DoD instruction on how this dispute resolution process was supposed to happen, that there were timelines in place. Once we sent in our request for dispute resolution, we were supposed to have a inspection within, I believe, 7 days of submitting our request. That did not happen.
Yeah.
Right. That did not happen. I believe in our case, it extended actually over 30 days for the inspection after we submitted our request for dispute resolution. So that was the first red flag. The other issue that was significant for us was we're entitled to a third-party investigator, someone else who's not involved in this process, to come in and investigate the circumstances, what's happening, what's driving this dispute, and kind of give their opinion on things.
And
in our case, go ahead.
If I recall, you brought up to the base that these things weren't happening properly, correct?
That's correct. That is correct. I had sent an email over to the Camp Pendleton Government Housing Office, who was, essentially managing our dispute resolution case, and had requested and notified them that we wanted a third-party investigator. The response I received via email was no.
Yeah, that's. I mean, was that just frustrating? Was it? I mean, did you feel like the process was tainted at that point? What was sort of going through your head?
Definitely. I was highly frustrated. I felt, it was another runaround, the same type of runaround we had been dealing with Liberty was now transcending into what was supposed to be a process intended to help families. It seemed that it was not effective. So it definitely was frustrating for us.
And, after we wrote about that in Stars and Stripes, after you spoke to me, I contacted the Marine Corps Installation Command, who told me that it was your case that highlighted as they called it, ambiguity in the dispute resolution policy regarding independent investigators. And upon reviewing your case, they decided that the Marine Corps needs to do more to make sure that piece of dispute resolution happens, because it wasn't just your case that the Marine Corps found fault in for not hiring that investigator. It was all the cases that happened at Camp Pendleton, which I think was 2 other families, and then also a case at Camp Lejeune. Tell me, after, this process ended, did it create any sort of change in your family's experience in housing?
Definitely not a positive change. As far as where we are today, we're still in our house. Our kitchen is under containment. Again, since June of 2021, we're now in May of 2022.
So a full year later, you've gone through dispute resolution and it still hasn't resolved the maintenance request you were disputing.
Correct. It hasn't resolved. We've had various other issues we reported as well, and subsequently discovered when we reviewed maintenance records of our home that we were concerned about, specifically with mold, and that has not been remediated either. As of right now, we're really in the weeds of what I feel the weeds of negotiation with Liberty. The dispute resolution process, which was intended to help families, has failed. So now we're essentially back to square one, in which we're negotiating with Liberty to get them to do the right thing, relocate us, displace us. One of the biggest concerns I have is Liberty at this time won't agree to displace our family unless we sign their displacement agreement. Within that agreement are financial terms that I don't agree to. So, in my view, it's essentially, if you want to get out of that unsafe home, you need to release us of these financial liabilities. And I feel that that's unjust and unfair for our family, as well as, every other military family. who's going through this.
And for your family, it's been difficult to sort of cut ties with housing and move off base, because you have a large family and California is expensive.
Yes, we have a large family. We have 4 children who live with us full time, and my husband has a daughter who visits routinely as well. And financially, we can't afford to, especially in the market that's happening now. It's unattainable for us just to up and move and pay a hefty deposit and then an increased rent. It's unattainable.
Yeah, that's a big challenge for a lot of military families. The last thing I wanted to ask you about is, you're someone that's experienced this process from beginning to end. And I'm wondering what you would advocate needs to be done to strengthen this process for military families.
I would definitely think, it should go back to Congress. It needs to be reviewed at the highest level possible and focus on any of, as you said, those ambiguities, those gray areas that, really make this dispute resolution process fail. We get hung up on disagreements in the gray areas of how, procedurally this is supposed to roll out, and I feel that in getting hung up on those issues, it takes away from the purpose of this process, which again is to afford rights to military families and also to ensure that they have safe and habitable housing. I think that from the highest level, it really needs to be thoroughly reviewed. All the issues that families are being vocal about and bringing to people's attention need to be taken seriously. I believe that at least at the base level and the command level, that the commanding general and others involved, including legal counsel, need to take seriously the complaints of families and figure out, how can we help instead of kind of taking a back seat to this and not taking these issues seriously.
I think it's interesting that the commander sided with the housing company. If he'd have sided with the family, what's the harm to the Marine Corps? What's the harm to the military for him to side with the family and say, hey, let's get them into some type of, temporary lodging or some housing while this is getting fixed?
There's been a lot of debate about that because the Marine Corps is in this case specifically, the Marine Corps is in a partnership with Liberty Military Housing. So they're sort of one in the same entity. The housing company has a contract from the Marine Corps to provide this housing. So some people have complained that in itself is a conflict of interest and the commander shouldn't be making these decisions of disputes between their business partner and the person and renting from their business partner. And another issue that's come up that Rachel Christian, who I spoke to, brought up when she was speaking to a subcommittee in the Senate, she was testifying on the Hill, is that these commanders, when they make everything related to dispute resolution then gets passed from that commander up to his chain of command. So if, say, a commander was to make a decision that, the company was at fault, it's also saying that his oversight that he provides was not satisfactory and he let this happen on his watch. So Rachel Christian brought up a good point that she has seen retaliation in these cases where people ask for dispute resolution because the commanders see it as a ding on their record.
This actually is a problem we've had in the military for some time. If you present a problem, it is not handled as a situation that can be remedied and that it's good that you brought the problem up so that we can fix it. It's often treated as, if there's a problem, this is a direct reflection of my leadership, which means my leadership has a problem. My leadership is a problem. I am somehow soiled by you bringing problems to me. Therefore, we should squash the problem. And if the problem goes away, it makes my career and my progression safe from potential from potentially being deterred.
Correct. That's what some of the advocates are also seeing and have a lot of concerns about.
Alexis mentioned the additional challenge of the current housing market. Home prices have skyrocketed recently, making finding an affordable home very tough.
Yeah, I spoke to an Air Force family this week who their dispute was resolved, and the commander sided with the housing company at this instance as well, and said, but I have ordered them to allow you to break your lease with no financial burden, right? You can just break your lease and move, which sounds great, but they're struggling. They're at Grand Forks Air Force Base, and they got $1,600 a month, and it's a family of 4, and they're just really having a hard time.
So it's almost like, shut up, stop complaining, and be happy with your biohazard home, or you can kick rocks and good luck in the economy and the market that is the housing market right now.
Yeah, the housing market has got to be a difficult one, especially at some of these installations where it's expensive. It's expensive to be there.
Was there any resolution to Alexis Jennings' situation, or how is she doing now?
So Alexis, it's been 5 months since the commander said that she needed to let them in to make changes or make renovations, and that they needed to come in and make the renovations. So far, she said that all that's happened is a worker came to her house and said he was there to fix the outdoor spigot that was leaking, where her water hose hooks up. So he fixed that. And while he was there, he said, do you need anything else? And she said, well, my refrigerator's been in my garage for months. Can you help me move it in? So he moved her refrigerator in, and that's the only work that's been done.
When we return from the break, Rose talks with an advocate working on Capitol Hill to make real change happen. But what will it take to make this quote-unquote Bill of Tenants' Rights actually mean something to the tenants it's supposed to protect? Find out after the break. Ideal for fishing, especially if one needs to quickly cut a line, the Romeo folding knife comes with a light carbon fiber handle with an amazing grip and a D2 steel blade. Fair warning, the blade is extremely sharp and cuts through the toughest materials. What makes it simple is the flipper tab. The knife pops open for quick use, all in one single motion. Go to tektogear.com today. Tektogear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Use discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase.
So Rachel Christian works with the Armed Forces Housing Advocates, and she works in doing legislative work with them on Capitol Hill. And she's really advocating right now. She's got a packet of information she's been passing around to senators and representatives to try to get some real teeth into the Tenant Bill of Rights and some of these other congressional reforms that have already gone through on military family housing. And she's finding the ways that they're not working and giving really good examples of how they can work.
Before the Tenants Bill of Rights passed, we were seeing the uninhabitable and unsafe homes that military families were living in, but the families were having no recourse or any real route to try and validate their concerns through a process or procedure. They also weren't able to tangibly see what rights they had in their homes, but we are consistently seeing things like faulty construction, electrical wiring, environmental hazards like lead and mold, pest infestations, and sewage issues.
So would you say that any of those issues have changed, or has the recourse and the understanding of what they can do about it, has that changed?
I would say absolutely nothing has changed, unfortunately. I would love to be able to sit here and tell you that there has been some changes that we can see, but that's just not the case. You will be able to move forth with a dispute process, which was not occurring previously, which is a great option for families if it were to be implemented with any type of real actionable items in it.
And I've been speaking to a couple other families, one who will be joining us on this podcast at one point as well. she saw, deadlines missed in her case, and she saw, her independent investigator wasn't hired for the dispute resolution process. And even after she brought it to the base's attention, they didn't seem to mind. They were fine going forward without following the policy. Is that the kind of stuff you're seeing all around?
Absolutely. There is no consequence for not following the Tenants' Bill of Rights, and there is no enforcement mechanism for if a housing company decides to not follow the process, nor if the DOD decides to not follow the process. It's really up to their own cognizance to really follow that.
And so are y'all advocating at all for any sort of follow-up to be done to these dispute resolution cases?
Absolutely. So we actually have a full document that we've been providing to members of Congress, as well as to any media outlets who are willing to look at them, about every single right that we have, the 18 rights, and where we see places where we can improve. And that's something we're really pushing for, because we know that the Tenants' Bill of Rights is something that Congress really worked hard to do with hopes that it would assist. But we do see that there are loopholes that the housing companies and the DOD are using to get out of actually implementing those rights. So we have a substantive list of all 18 that you can see where we would want to better each right.
And as far as those 18 rights, are there any where you've seen some positive movement where they're actually working?
I have witnessed every single one of these rights be trampled on by either the housing company or by the government housing offices themselves. I would like to say that there are some successful cases that we have seen of families being able to cite that they have these rights, because previously that was not the case, and it did move in a positive direction, but it's not actually changing the actions of the housing companies or the actions of the DOD. It's just more of an ability to force their hand with something in writing.
Mm-hmm. Are there any examples of other rights where you're asking for specific improvements that you think, maybe an example of an improvement that could be a simple fix that would make a drastic positive change?
Absolutely. Defining habitability and defining industry standard for these rights would be extremely helpful for our families. Habitability is defined for housing units differently across every state if you look at standard landlord-tenant law. So it's really confusing for a military family who's living on federal property to be able to try and cite a standard from state to state. So giving a general habitability requirement, something as simple as habitable housing includes safe water. That's not anything that's definable. And we got a lot of pushback in Hawaii during the water crisis there when there was not actual potable water in these homes.
Mm-hmm. You spoke to Congress twice this year already. What is the main point you're trying to get across when you're speaking to members of the House or the Senate?
I absolutely want them to know that this is a systemic problem. This is not 1Z, 2Z cases. This is not just the histrionic spouse that comes out and says that her house isn't good enough. This is a systemic issue from the top of these corporations that are running military housing. They need to force the hands of those conducting oversight, specifically the Department of Defense, to revoke the contracts of the companies or to just hold up their agreements, which they are not currently doing.
Mm-hmm. And of the reforms, I know you mentioned y'all have several that you're pushing. What can you talk a little bit more about any others specifically that you'd like to see in the NDAA this year?
So while we're working on those reforms for the Tenants' Bill of Rights, we're also working to strengthen Evans Law. Evans Law is a law that will keep children safe. Military kids fall out of windows at an astronomical rate. We have a lot of homes that have very low windowsills and no air conditioning. So when you have a windowsill that's at toddler height and a 3-year-old walks over and pushes a mosquito screen out, the chances are that they will fall is astronomical. And I will tell you that there were 7 kids in San Diego that fell from windows in just 2 years. So we really need to strengthen Evans law. And the way that we're wanting to do that is to have the DoD provide grant money to the housing companies so that they may be able to place window guards in the homes. And I will tell you, the grant pot is already there. It's already available. The DoD has just failed to fund it.
And are these safety things for the windows, are they expensive?
No. So a window guard will cost around $70 for the total installation, for the actual piece and the installation. And it takes about 3 minutes. You just bring it in, you drill it into the walls. But some of these housing companies are charging upwards of $1,500 for families to get window guards in their homes. And then they're keeping the window guards for themselves and then charging the families at move out for destroying the property.
Wow. And you talked about this in the House when you testified. Can you talk about again why military kids are sort of more vulnerable to these window falls?
So statistically, there has just been military children falling at a higher rate. And there's been some debate as to why that is, but kids are moving every 2 to 3 years. These are unfamiliar homes that they're in. They are uprooted from their environment quite frequently. And so when you're having that situation, there's not really anything you can do to remind a child who's 3 or 4 that, hey, these new windows aren't as good as the old one. You might be moving from a 1-story to a 2-story. You went from air conditioning to no air conditioning. So the kids are not really aware of their surroundings. And I don't know if you've ever seen a toddler walk around. They're not graceful. They're not really aware of what's going on around them. And even if a mom or the dad or the child caregiver is right there, we've had instances where both parents watched their child fall just a few feet away from them because the window screen was not a real window screen. I remember when I was a kid, I could push on my window screens and they would not fall out. That's not the case in military housing. Some of these are just held up with duct tape. Some of them are missized. Some of them are even missing. So it's really what we need in military housing to keep kids safe. And if it's going to cost a very small portion of the NDAA budget, I think it's well worth it to keep a child from dying or from traumatic brain injury.
Mm-hmm. So, Rachel, one thing I have noticed in reading the Tenant Bill of Rights and some of the reforms, and also in testimony that's been given to Congress, is families with family members with disabilities often don't see themselves in these reforms. Can you talk about how family members of military members, those family members with disabilities, are still struggling to get what they need in military housing?
Military families with disabilities are being faced with excessive amounts of red tape to get even the minorest accommodation in their home. Something like flashers for someone who is hearing impaired. Something like a flooring that they can roll their wheelchair over. Recently, our nonprofit had to pay out of pocket from ourselves just to help fund a military family who was refused to switch their carpeting to a hard floor so that they could use their wheelchair. That's unacceptable. Military families who are being—
I've seen that before as well, and that seems really frustrating that an ADA home would have carpet in it.
And it shouldn't be that way. There should be strict standards to accommodate families with disabilities, especially when you're asking them to move from one installation to the next.
And is the problem that the housing companies aren't following federal laws for ADA compliance, or is it that the federal laws don't apply to them?
So it's a little bit of both, right? So this isn't like a HUD property where they have to comply with those, but they do have to make the accommodation. So 5% of all homes on military installation should either be ADA accessible or like actual qualified ADA homes, or they can be easily modifiable. And that is the loophole that they're getting away with, having these homes that have carpeting and calling them ADA, because they're saying they will modify them and they just choose not to.
Mm-hmm. Does it seem to be a cost factor of why they don't want to modify, or they just seem to be there?
Absolutely not. It is not just a cost factor. I recently had a case where a service member was requiring having additional portable AC unit in their bedroom, which they purchased for themselves and put in. And he had the medical documentation showing that he had a disability, that it was required from his doctor. And housing company kept telling them that they were going to get fined for having that piece of equipment because they didn't believe that he had a disability, even though his doctor has stated he did. So that cost them $0.
This is you've hit this story a couple of times in your career, different aspects of it. And, we're kind of right back here again. We're talking about Bill of Rights. We're talking about service members and spouses, children falling out of windows, mold growing in people's homes. Where, having covered this for the last couple of years, where are we right now? Have you, where do you think this is going, and in what direction?
It's hard to say really what direction it's going. I think it's continuing to get attention, and rightfully so. The Senate Subcommittee on Permanent Investigations recently, looked into a company called Balfour Beatty. And this company actually faced criminal charges because they were changing maintenance work data to get their bonuses from the military. And the Senate dug into this. They looked at the time period after they were charged. So the time period they were charged for being, these criminal charges ended in 2019. The Senate looked at 2019 to the present day and found that these exact same things are still going on. So it's a little disheartening when you see things like that. In the instance of the Senate investigation, it was just 2 bases. So perhaps it's not systemic. Balfour Beatty told the Senate that they don't think it's a systemic issue. I think for the sake of military families, I try to be optimistic that, maybe this time around we'll really get the change they were looking for 2 to 3 years ago. This whole issue of military housing reform is something I've been following for I've been at Stripes for 4 years and probably close to that entire time. So about 3 years now. And it's evolved and it's changed, but also there's a lot of aspects of it that remain the same. And I highly encourage anyone that, wants to know more about this subject or learn, what the housing companies, what changes they've made, or maybe how the military is doing more. I've got a number of articles at stripes.com. You can check out. Some of the more recent coverage is about how Congress would like to make changes to the Tenant Bill of Rights to give families and the military more teeth to hold companies accountable for bad behavior.
I have a question. I don't know if you can answer it, but here it is. The last episode we did on military housing, one of our lowest listened to episodes.
Yeah.
And I was shocked, but then I was talking to Jack Murphy about this, and he was like, well, this is so embedded into our life about how bad the barracks are, how bad housing is. It's not a shock anymore to a lot of people. It kind of like, one person actually wrote, oh my gosh, we get it. It sucks. And I'm like, why are you being so callous about we're talking about families and children. We talked about children dying back in the 70s and 80s from a couple of different things. So what are your thoughts on why maybe there's a sense of whatever in the military community about this?
It's a good point, because when I write these stories, they don't get as much traffic as, some of the other stories that I've written in the past, or other subjects in general. If I mention the lawsuits on occasion, those will get more traffic. For example, a number of families sued at Big Dill Air Force Base, and that is now gone into a pending settlement. We don't know the results of that settlement because it's private. But those stories tend to get more attention. I don't know if it's just because people like to read about lawsuits. But yeah, and maybe it's because military family housing, it only makes up about 20% of housing available to service members. Most of them are living off base. So maybe those folks who don't live on base just write this off as it's not my problem, which is disappointing because it's your teammates. So.
Well, Rose Thayer, thank you so much for continuing to cover these stories that I personally feel are extremely important, especially right now. We just, we talked about, we hit on the housing market. There are not very many options. The options are closing, I should say, for a lot of military families. It's expensive. It's, inventory is getting progressively lower. Prices are higher. It is not easy to find a home right now when you're on the government salary, even for the, I know there are E8s who are trying to find E8s, E9s who are trying to find homes, and they can't find them. They can't afford those homes. I can't imagine in a family, E1, E4, trying to find a home in today's market.
Yeah, I bought a house myself 2 years ago, and I know it's not easy out there. It's competitive.
Very well. Rose, thank you so much for doing everything that you're doing. And where can people find you? Where do you exist on the interwebs?
You can find me on Twitter at Rose_Lori, LORI. And you can find me at stripes.com.
Be sure to check out Rose Thayer's articles on stripes.com. You can get 50% off your digital subscription to Stars and Stripes when you use promo code PODCAST. That's 50% off your digital subscription when you use promo code PODCAST. Be sure to follow Military Matters on Twitter at StripesMMPod. And as always, you can find me at RodPodRod and Jack Murphy at Jack Murphy RGR. Thanks for listening. Be sure to leave us a review and a 5-star rating if you think we earned it. I'm Rod Rodriguez, and we'll see you at the next episode. This episode is brought to you by Tektogear, TEKTOGEAR.com, a Portland, Maine-based tactical knife company. The knives are created by the CNC process to provide the best precision, functionality, and beauty. The Tektogear knives won't cost you half a month's rent either. Today, Tektogear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Go to TEKTOGEAR.com. Use discount code STRIPES, that's STRIPES. Go to Tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase.